Good morning, everybody. It's my great pleasure to be here today, and I'd like to talk to you about resilience. This is a picture of my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, Nancy Staples, and she's leaning on the gate at the end of our gardens and the land that we worked 2 generations ago. My earliest childhood memories are of her and my great-grandmother and my grandfather, particularly at this time of the year, trying to eke out every ounce of nutritional value and economic value from our gardens and from the land. It was a time to harvest, but it was a time to preserve, to jam, to pickle, in any shape, way, or form, that nutritional value, so that we could take the bounty of the summer and extend it for us, our family, but also for the poorer members of the community around through the winter months. She was born at the beginning of one World War, lived through a second, and survived polio. She was tough. And when I think about resilience, I think about her generosity, her toughness, and many like her in that generation. But let's talk about resilience today. This is a picture of the Hotel Montana, taken in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, just after the devastating earthquake in 2010. As you can see, it pancaked, killing 200 people or more as it did so. It simply wasn't built to resist the shock. Today, we have to be more concerned about natural disasters than ever before. In the past 30 years, the economic losses from natural disasters have more than tripled. The number of natural disasters has actually doubled. Let's look at the numbers. Over the past 30 years, in low-income and middle-income countries alone, we have lost $1.2 trillion due to damage. That is equivalent to the GDP annually of Mexico. Another way to think of it is that it is equivalent to 1/3 of all of the official development assistance that we've given in the same time period. So think that for every $3 of overseas development aid that we've given, we've taken one and thrown it away. In the same period, those same 30 years, 2.3 million people have perished. That's the population of Namibia. This is something that we need to pay attention to. And it's getting more difficult. Climate change is ravaging, especially poor countries. Already, this is not a phenomenon for the future. It's for us today. Already, countries are trying to work their way through the complex nexus between a food crisis, a water crisis, and an energy crisis. And climate change is just making it more difficult and raising uncertainty. At the same time, over the next 40 years, we will add 2.6 billion people to the cities of the world, most of that in developing countries. In fact, 90% of that growth will be in South Asia and Africa. And between now and 2050, we will double the number of people exposed to cyclones and mudslides and collapse as a result of natural disasters in urban settings to more than 1.5 billion people. The lack of building codes, the lack of enforced building codes, will punish these people. And it will be the poor, for it is always the poor, the most vulnerable, that will suffer most. So think of this story that we are beginning to understand. We have more and more disasters. Their intensity is being developed by climate change. Climate change is adding to uncertainty. And we have a path of urbanization that this civilization has never seen before. How do we invest in our resilience? Well, there are 2 key ways. First of all, we actually have to change our growth path. We need to move to a greener and more inclusive growth now. Every country can start on that journey. We must mitigate and adapt to climate change. At the same time, we need to invest in disaster risk management. Disaster risk management must be part of development, but it must also be considered a first line of defense against the uncertainty that is coming tomorrow. We need action in the public sector. We need frameworks and public policy. We need awareness and investment in the private sector. And we need civil society and communities to engage. Now, I talked to you earlier on about the hotel in Haiti, the Hotel Montana, that had pancaked and collapsed. This is where we are today. This is the Westin in Sendai, a gorgeous 37-story hotel that survived the catastrophic earthquake on March the 11th, 2011, the Great Japan earthquake, with almost no damage at all. In fact, it served as a disaster response center. Disaster risk management is in the building code in Japan. Disaster risk management in the building code is enforced in Japan. Disaster risk management is part of the curricula in schools in Japan. And disaster risk management, not disaster, is part of the public discourse here in Japan. So every country, every government can take steps now, no matter where they are on the development trajectory, to try to start to invest in their own resilience. But there's much more that can be done by the international community as well. Often, we offer too little, too late. Between 1980 and 2009, the international community spent $90 billion on disaster-related assistance. But of that $90 billion, only 3.6% was invested in prevention and preparedness. The other 96% plus was invested in emergency response and reconstruction. We have to change those numbers. We have to switch that graph around. In fact, we have to move from a tradition of response to a culture of prevention, a culture of resilience. But let me give you an example of what does seem to start working. This is the island of St. Lucia in the Caribbean, a small island developing state buffeted by storms and hurricanes, where landslides are unfortunately far too often part of the rhythm of life there. In 2008, the World Bank, working with 5 communities on the island, started to try to invest in the resilience of these communities and their ability to withstand and to avoid landslides. And we built these hillside drains. In 2010, when Hurricane Tomas hit the island, unfortunately many communities suffered the landslides that are so often part of the rhythm of life there. But the 5 communities where these hillside drains had been built suffered no losses at all. It's important to understand the economics of this project as well. For every dollar that the community invested in these drains, it saved another $3 that it would have had to spend on response and on reconstruction if they had not taken the steps towards preparedness. So, if disaster risk resilience seems to make such good economic and business sense, is the private sector interested? Is the private sector investing? Well, the good news is that leaders are. This is a picture of the port of Cartagena in Colombia, which is operated by a private firm, Muelles de Bosque, on a long-term government concession. Recently, they undertook a study together with the International Finance Corporation, the private sector lending arm of the World Bank, where they looked at the risks to the port operating environment from changes in climate and changes in weather pattern. What was interesting is that in order to get the data for the report, they had to go to 30 different public and private sources, which shows that there's much to be done to make the data and awareness of these issues more available to public and private sector alike. But the report resulted in recommendations from changing the dredging regime for the way that ships approach the port, to drainage, to on-side land operations. So, for example, changing the heights of roads and things like this. And as a result of those recommendations, Muelles de Bosque invested $30 million in new capital construction in order to make them more resilient, in order to improve their operations going forward. So this port company was able to see the benefit from investing in their ability to be resilient going forward, and that this was a commercial advantage to them. So I've talked about the public sector, and I've talked about the private sector. And now we need to talk about community. We know empirically that communities that have stronger social bonds do better in disaster. We know that, in fact, those strong social bonds are one of the strongest determinants of resilience within the community. I mean, it makes intuitive sense. Neighbours know which neighbour needs help, which neighbour is vulnerable, which neighbour is weakest. We also know that families, neighbours, and friends are the ones that help reconstruct first after disaster has hit. And so when we think of resilience, this is not an adapt construct. It's not just a word that is thrown around in development circles. Resilience is both the need for public policy and the need for private investment. It's also about a different response from the international community, and it is about the local municipal leaders, the mayors that we elect to lead us through these uncertain times. But resilience, very importantly, is about community. I think the people of Japan know that. I think that my grandmother, her friends, and others in our community when I was growing up knew that too. And so for me personally, when I think of resilience, I think of top-down policy and investment flows, but I think of bottom-up building of community. For me, resilience is about you and me and the bonds that bring us together. Thank you.